Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and today we're looking at how emotions, and particularly anxiety brought on by the COVID pandemic, shape or influence voters' preferences. Hello, my name is Jennifer Hudson, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Today, we're looking at a new piece of research, Flight to Safety, COVID-induced changes in the intensity of status quo preferences and voting behavior, forthcoming in the American Political Science Review. This paper focuses on some important questions around COVID. How do emotions, and particularly anxiety, shape or influence voters' preferences? How does anxiety resulting from this unforeseen external force, COVID, or manufactured for political gain, how does it influence democratic politics and elections? Are voters inherently risk averse during periods of uncertainty? And how did COVID induce a flight to safety among voters? My guest today, along with his co-author James Bisbee of New York University, has been exploring this question. Dan Honig is Associate Professor of Public Policy here at UCL's Department of Political Science. Among Dan's key publications are around supportive management and practice and intrinsic motivation go together in the public service in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. He's also the author of Navigation by Judgment, Why and When Top-Down Management of Foreign Aid Doesn't Work, with Oxford University Press. Dan's current work is focusing on mission-driven bureaucrats, exploring the relationship between motivation, management practice, and performance in Bangladesh, Ghana, Thailand, and the US, amongst other places. So the work we're looking at today isn't in typical Dan's research agenda, but it's fascinating nonetheless. Dan, welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics.
Thank you. Really a pleasure to be here. Really looking forward to the conversation.
Before we get to the approach and the key findings of your piece, could you give us a little bit of background? What sparked your interest in this piece in the first place?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a great question. I always want to know where kind of folks' ideas come from myself. So, if I'm honest, as you say, this isn't kind of a piece with some of the other topics I focus on. And I guess that's because this came from a pretty personal place. So I was living in Senegal when COVID came. And as the world first started being concerned about COVID, I was pretty sick. So I had what seemed like pneumonia, but wasn't going away. In retrospect, it very well could have been COVID. But the moment it dawned on me that it might be COVID, and that might be something I needed to be worried about, I was sitting in bed, having trouble breathing in the middle of the day, unable to work, reading an article from the New York Times about COVID on my phone, and I had this thought that I, all of a sudden, sort of surprisingly for me, I spent a lot of my life living overseas, wanted to be in kind of the safest, most secure place I could think of. I wanted to be home. I wanted to be in the safety of where I grew up, which is Detroit in the U.S. And I guess that seemed like an unusual. I was surprised by my own reaction, if I'm honest. And the very next story in the New York Times that I read was about the then still very hot. This is early March 2020. About the then still very hot Bernie Biden Democratic primary. And I thought to myself, I think conventional theories of political science would suggest that COVID should be Bernie, should push folks towards Sanders because, of course, Bernie Sanders has this sort of focus on healthcare, focus on workers' rights, and clearly, if this becomes a big thing, we're going to get a lot of economic disruption, et cetera. That said, I think this feeling that I'm feeling right now of wanting to be somewhere kind of safe and secure is going to push people more towards the known. And I bet you this ends up helping Biden rather than Bernie. And so, I wrote Jim Bisbee, who you mentioned, my co-author on this piece, sent him a WhatsApp text and said, hey, do you agree with me? This is kind of what conventional wisdom would be. And also that it might well be wrong in this case, and that we might be able to kind of pre-register and test and explore that. And he thought it sounded like a good idea, and so we put together a plan and took it from there. But in some ways, the source of this project is not sort of a deep reading of theory. It was some broad knowledge of the field combined with sort of a personal instinct and reflection on that.
Dan, your work is based on the idea that anxiety is altering voters' preference for the status quo, and that this induces what you call a political flight to safety towards establishment candidates. Tell me a little bit more about this flight to safety analogy and how it's underpinning voters' calculus.
Yeah, so actually the sort of formulation of this as a flight to safety is in those original text messages from like the first 20 minutes that Jim and I were talking about the idea. And then when we turned to the literature, and I should say, and the analogy there is that at least we had in mind initially was very much the economist's flight to safety in financial markets, which is this notion that in the face of uncertainty, people de-risk, market players de-risk and shift to safer assets, U.S. Treasury bonds rather than emerging market stocks, something like that, right? But as we kind of dug into and thought hard about and reasoned together with the kind of existing literature on voters' behavior, we realized that there were a lot of kind of near neighbors that could explain this phenomenon. And we wanted to think really carefully about what was different here, what we thought was different here. So, the kind of the sort of standard model of voting is a sort of spatial model where voters are trying to minimize the distance between themselves and the candidate, right? So if there are two candidates and my view is closer to candidate A than candidate B, I'm going to vote for candidate A because she has the position more proximate to my own. So one thing that anxiety could do, or that COVID could do, is actually just shift the preferences, right? It could shift someone's preferences in the spatial model. Another thing that it could do is it could affect kind of like the candidate qualities, what's sometimes called the valence term in this equation. So, perhaps people just prefer candidates with greater leadership qualities in response to what they perceive to be greater leadership qualities in response to anxiety. And we meant a third thing here, which is that independent of candidate qualities, independent of candidate positions, and in fact, maybe even overwhelming candidate positions, that uncertainty and anxiety bring a preference for the known, for the status quo, which pushes in some sense from both directions. It's not a left preference, it's not a right preference, it's a kind of known and thus largely center preference. We thought that sort of differentiating that and making that clear was kind of an important theoretical contribution to the paper.
Before we talk about who you might think might benefit from this kind of anxiety phenomenon, you talked a little bit in the paper about system justification theory, and could you explain to the listeners a little bit about how this kind of works or interacts with your idea about this kind of return to safety or flight to safety?
Yeah, totally. So first, I should say system justification theory is in the paper due to a reviewer comment initially. So a reviewer mentioned this in their review. Academics are always complaining about reviews that sort of force the paper to be things it isn't. This is a case where it kind of unveiled to us wonderful literature that admittedly we had not known about. And so system justification theory is a theory which comes from psychology and has this notion that some people have an inherent need to defend or justify aspects of the existing social, economic, and political order. And this. So in essence, what we're saying is this becomes more salient. This need to justify in the presence of anxiety or uncertainty. What's particularly interesting for our case actually is that system justification theory, at least some of the leading proponents of it, have talked about different people as having kind of different inherent levels of need to system justify, right? So some people are more interested in justification than others. And in fact, there's a kind of prominent paper on Democratic candidates in the 2016 primary in which Bernie voters are the least likely to need to system justify, right? So in the internal terms um, of this argument, one thing I find pretty cool is that Bernie Sanders voters transferring away from Bernie is a high bar case for the theory. It's a case where we should expect people to be less likely, according to the theory itself, to justify. And I should say more broadly, I think it's a great example of what we as political scientists or public policy scholars can learn through bricolage, by borrowing from other fields. I think in some sense our ideas were sitting there in psychology, even psychology as applied to politics, but at least to my knowledge, kind of hadn't yet been incorporated into political science.
Okay, that's really fantastic, and I think interesting to kind of draw it back to think about 2016 and what Sanders voters were thinking then. Um, tell our listeners a little bit about who you think is going to benefit when anxiety is present. So it's not conservative candidates in the kind of capital C conservative in the UK. It's small c conservative candidates, status quo candidates, and it's not just that exists on both sides of the spectrum. So candidates
Yeah.
who are across the spectrum, it's going to be the safer candidate. Explain that to our listeners.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's a great question. So what we mean by conservative is exactly as you say, kind of status quo preserving. So candidates from both the left and the right, and any other direction we might want to hypothesize, uh, can be and sometimes are disruptive. They promise a break from the past. They promise radical change, right? So in some ways, I would say that Donald Trump is a system disruptive candidate from the right, or at least was in 2016, just as Bernie Sanders is a system disruptive candidate from the left. I'm not going to embarrass myself with the UK analogs, but I am sure there are many that will come to listeners' minds. And in general, the idea here is that uh, people have a preference, particularly under conditions of anxiety, for what they know and understand, whether it maybe serves their interests or not. And that anxiety pushes people more towards those known candidates. And in that sense, candidates who've been around for a while, candidates who are in line with kind of prevailing norms and wisdom about governance in that country. These are the candidates we think will benefit from this flight to safety. They're the safe ones.
Great. Now, before we get into the kind of how you answered this question, part of your argument here is essentially that the framework that you're using allows you to make sense of electoral outcomes in which voters might appear to vote against things that are in their self-interest. Can you give us an example of what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. So just because it's part of how we test it, though not the only way, So take a voter who's considering voting for Bernie Sanders because Bernie promises social protections, worker protections, healthcare from which this voter would benefit. So in a spatial model, this hypothetical voter is closer to Bernie than to any other alternative. The sense of anxiety and uncertainty, the flight to safety, might push that voter away from the candidate in their material interests, just because all of a sudden that seems so risky. I mean, in some sense, I think we've all been there in our own lives. A lot's going on, a lot's up in turmoil, and we say, let's go to the restaurant we already know rather than the one that we've been meaning to try. That seems exciting, but who knows? Let's go with the safe and the known, which is fine, rather than rather than venture out for something that in expectation is more exciting, but also is not as familiar. And maybe that doesn't serve your interests. I don't mean to trivialize politics, obviously much more important, but I mean to say I think this is a kind of instinct, a human instinct, which runs well beyond politics, and sometimes may well not serve our interests in a variety of domains.
All right, let's talk about your approach in this paper. Your main analysis looks at the impact of COVID-19 on the fortunes of Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, the two leading candidates for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination in 2020. Why focus on the Democratic primary? And in the paper you talk about the kind of safe and the more radical candidates. So can you set that up for our listeners?
Yeah, sure. So there are kind of two answers to that question. The first answer, which is true, is because literally that's the example I thought of when I was lying in bed in Senegal and had the idea. I have to admit that there's some path dependence there, but also, the timing from a kind of like causal inference, figuring out what was going on in the world standpoint was really great in the sense that uh, American political primaries happen in different states on different days. And that means some of the primaries had already happened. Some of them were just starting to happen as COVID became more salient. This was all done before this was true, but if COVID became a pretty big thing, which I was starting to feel it really was, there were also going to be a lot of primaries after COVID was was a more generalized concern. And so we could kind of see the geographic spread of fear in some sense, right? And it sounds like we'll get into how we did that in a minute, so I won't go there at the moment. But you know, and it the statements of both candidates made clear that they both agreed that Biden was the safe candidate and Bernie the disruptive one, right? So Bernie's statements were very much, we need to change a broken system, right? Biden's perspective was very much, look, we've had all of this instability under Trump. What we need to do is go back to kind of status quo ante. We need to go back to kind of the known and understood, and in Biden's view, better political order. And this was not a case where like the candidates were competing to be the stable one or competing to be the disruptive one. They're making very clear and distinct pitches in this regard. And the fact that that was true and the primaries were rolling out at just the right time, and it was frankly a high salience election for both Jim and I, both of whom are Americans, I think is what drew us to that. As you kind of hinted at in the question, of course, we wanted to make sure it wasn't just a phenomenon confined to one race, and we explore a number of other contexts and try to kind of nail that this is an instantiation, this is an instance, but this isn't just kind of a 2020 Democratic primary story. This is a story, and here we see it in quite a nuanced way that lets us get a causal inference in the case of the Democratic primary.
Fantastic. So you have this expectation that voters are going to move away from Sanders and move towards Biden. Tell us a little bit about how you measured your key explanatory variables. So how are you going about actually trying to capture anxiety, and what are some of the different data sources that you brought to bear on that?
Yeah, so I just actually literally said, I think, like, show the geographic spread of fear or something very close to that. So how exactly do you measure fear? I mean, it'd be amazing if there was some kind of fear detector that we could see in our lives. I or maybe not amazing. I can imagine all the social situations that would make it even more awkward. Actually, now that I have the thought. But in any case, the way we look at the spread is first we look at actual COVID cases. So at first, I mean, it feels almost impossible to remember, but like if you, the listener, can put yourself like the day you heard Tom Hanks had gotten COVID in like Australia, if I remember right, and his wife, who is also famous in her own right. Forgive me, this is not my
Rita
domain.
Wilson.
Rita Wilson, thank you. If you think about that day, like that was kind of the last moment that like COVID felt like a local thing. So in America, at least, there'd been a few cases in Seattle. There'd been a few cases over here. It was something that felt like um, it was maybe a coming threat, but it was kind of far off. And at least in the U.S., our president was making very clear this was going to go away very soon. It was not something we needed to worry about at any great depth. Clearly, a fine prediction on his part, but yeah, and so at that time, the existence of cases was kind of something that worried people more locally than it did nationally, at least in the US. That's what we posited. And so the first thing we do is we look at kind of just the existence of cases in a DMA, which is like a designated metropolitan area. So that would be kind of like local news, local radio, kind of local talk rather than kind of what is on the national news or a national story, et cetera. And you might say, okay, well, Dan, it's all well and good for you to think that. Is that really the case? Well, we can see that we use cell phone mobility data to show that where there were cases in a DMA, people started traveling less, right? So COVID cases show up, and then folks say, you know what, maybe I'm not going to go to that concert that I was planning to go to on Tuesday. Like maybe I'll order my groceries from home this week, right? And we see those as, I mean, we don't have specific knowledge of the specific choices, but overall, we see less mobility, which we think it is reasonable to associate with kind of increasing fear. We also look at Google search data, and where cases were present, people started searching for COVID much more in that DMA, but not in matched DMAs, which were similar but did not have COVID cases in them at the time. And so, we think this plausibly demonstrates fear and the geographic spread of fear. And then we use this to kind of compare DMAs that had cases and didn't in their voting behavior. And in some models, in fact, we compare DMAs that, as of a certain date, had similar numbers of cases, but where the cases showed up either before or after the votes occurred, right? So, the vote comes in, did the cases happen to show up beforehand or afterwards? Thus, was it salient for those people who otherwise are as if equal to the other DMA at the time it happened, at the time the vote happened?
So it's a really impressive array of evidence, and I would strongly encourage our readers to kind of go and look at the paper and the amount of evidence that uh, Dan has brought to bear on this. What did you find? So you have this kind of impressive setup. You've got a really nice design here. Does anxiety drive voters away from Sanders and towards Biden?
Yes, that can be my shortest answer of the podcast. So it absolutely does. Now I'll expand on that just a tiny bit to say by quite a lot. So by 7, depending on how we model it, between 7 and 15 percentage points, right? Which is a pretty big swing in electoral terms. And this effect stands up to lots of different specifications and alternative ways of measuring things, et cetera. But yeah, the fear seems to matter a lot. Um, and it seems to, if you buy my story, that kind of Bernie's platform would otherwise be more attractive. That actually, in terms of like that spatial model, we should see the position grow, not shrink for Bernie. Those, in some sense, might be slight underestimates in that if Bernie had had a position which also was unfavorable or was equally favorable to kind of responding to a pandemic, we might have seen even bigger effects.
You were really, I think, energetic in this paper to try and tease out the finding kind of causally, and so you didn't stop at looking at this observational data around the 2020 Democratic primary, but you added in a survey experiment. Can you just briefly explain, what were you after in the survey experiment, and how did it give you more confidence in the claim that it is really this kind of anxiety that then drives away voters for the kind of more status quo or establishment candidates?
Yeah, sure. And actually, the survey experiment was part of our idea from the beginning, and we ran it, in March or perhaps April 2020, like when COVID was just kind of rolling out. And basically, the intuition for wanting to do it was, I just told you a story about Bernie's platform vis-a-vis Biden's, but maybe I have that entirely wrong. Maybe actually there were elements of Biden's platform. I'm sure if Biden's campaign manager were on the call, he or she would say, no, actually, Biden was the candidate better set up to respond to this pandemic because X, Y, Z. You also might think it's about, sort of leadership qualities or leadership experience or something like that, which might also be important, but would be a different kind of causal story than the one we're telling. So to kind of nail that this is about the anxiety, what we do is we do a survey experiment where we have 2 hypothetical candidates for office who are both newcomers. Neither has previously served in the job. One is promising sort of disruptive change. One is promising to kind of build on the important community foundations we have. And we randomize we randomize sort of other candidate features, which is as is done in these experiments. And then at the beginning of the experiment, people are given either a pessimistic or an optimistic prime about kind of the future course of COVID, which at that point people were unsure. Maybe this is going to go away in a month and a half. Maybe it's going to be around for quite some time. Who knows? And I should say, by the way, we tell everyone only true things, and by the end of the experiment, everyone has learned all the info. Just a question of whether you get the first bit of info before you answer the question about the candidates or not. So it's only like, have you been led to feel more pessimistic and scared and anxious about COVID just before you answer, or the other way around, more positive, more hopeful? And the people who are feeling more pessimistic, or who we've given the negative info at least, they are much more likely to choose the less disruptive candidate, the more status quo candidate. In this case, by construction, there are no differences in leadership or name or experience or political party or any other thing. And so we can say, okay, so here in like in an experimental setting, it's clear it's the anxiety working, and that should give us much more confidence that it's the anxiety and not some other feature of the particulars of Bernie and Biden, or the particulars of any other 2 or 200 candidates who we could compare to each other, which drives the effects we're seeing.
And so, not kind of happy with that as evidence. You and James also went out and looked at 2020 candidates in the U.S. House, and indeed, French municipal elections, which is a bit left field, really to try and get at this question of generalizability. So how far does the central finding about kind of a flight to safety, how well does it travel? And just give our listeners a bit of a summary about both the 2020 House elections and the French municipal elections.
Yeah, so that's right. We wanted to go beyond this kind of one race, between Bernie and Biden. And our first thought was U.S. House elections, because those primaries were happening at the same time, right? So we get the same kind of temporal effect. And what we show there is that being endorsed by the Justice Dems, which is kind of a left-wing disruptive Democratic group, or being endorsed by the Tea Party, which is a group on the right, which is interested in more disruptive change to the status quo, are both candidates of both stripes are penalized after by COVID cases, right? So that anxiety pushes voters away from those candidates, it seems. Of course, in this case, we can only observe each candidate at a particular time, because they only run in one place, right? They don't run nationally. But it does seem like when we compare across candidates, we see this generalized effect. The French elections, municipal elections, I have to say, Jim deserves all the credit for this idea. We both had this sense that we wanted to go beyond just America, but we had a lot of trouble finding elections that rolled out at the right time, and where we could kind of observe nuanced enough data on cases and on voting to be able to kind of say something meaningful. And we tried out 3 or 4 settings that we just couldn't make the data work. And then Jim, in conversation, I actually think with Charlotte Cavaille, Charlotte, if you're listening and I've misnamed you, apologize, came up with the idea of French municipal elections, which rolled out at the right time, and where we see the same thing. So the parties that are more associated with changing the status quo, their candidates do worse than we might otherwise expect in the wave of the municipal elections that happens after COVID cases start happening, as compared to the wave that happened before those COVID cases.
It's absolutely fascinating, and really encourage listeners to pick up the paper and see the breadth of data that Dan and James have brought to bear on this question. While we wrap up, Dan, I'd like to get your thoughts on the implications of the work. And at least one implication is that voters who might be disadvantaged under the status quo will defend it in order to reduce uncertainty. And they will do this particularly when anxiety is high. You show clear evidence of that. But the implication here is that we may not get reforms that we need because people are scared. They become risk averse and resort to the restaurant that they know, essentially, to go back to your original analogy. Talk us through what you think might be some of the negative implications of this flight to safety.
Yeah, totally. So I've actually never used this restaurant analogy before, or metaphor before, but just to extend it, maybe torture it a little bit more, like, what if the restaurant is serving you dishes which are high in cholesterol, right, which are bad for you in the long term, and the other restaurant isn't. Well, the if the flight to safety makes you stick with dining at that neighborhood pub, then that is probably not in your long term health. And I guess I have the same worry for democracy. So my view, which others need not share, but my view is we're in a political moment where we need uh, somewhat radical change to the status quo, where the current political equilibrium is not serving the majority of citizens most places terribly well, and we face kind of global existential threats like climate change that require a new way of thinking about politics and candidates willing to try things that have not been done before, that are indeed unknown. And I guess I worry that an implication of this paper is that radical change is harder if it scares people. I think we see results in other domains that kind of echo this. So, for example, I'm thinking of Omar Wazo's wonderful work, which shows that uh, in the civil rights movement in the American South, nonviolent protests pushed voters towards more civil rights action, and violent protests pushed voters away from action on positive action on civil rights, from equality inducing action, and candidates. When people are scared, they are much more likely to run away from the thing that scared them. And if the candidates who are proposing the necessary changes are also proposing changes that say, like, yeah, I'm from Detroit, we got to get rid of those gas powered engines. We have to change the way cars are made. I don't know. We need to change the way the economy and your life and your society works. I think those are scary things. And I think that may be a kind of break, a kind of friction on necessary change.
So, two final questions for you, and these are, purely speculative, which I think is okay to do at this stage. Um, you know, it's not to suggest that had we not had COVID, that Sanders would have won. I don't think you would be, willing to go that far. But what would you posit about Sanders' chances, or at least his performance, if we were under different kind of conditions where we didn't have COVID playing in the election, and it was just kind of a choice between Biden and Sanders in the primary? And then it got me thinking, kind of secondarily, is if what we're saying potentially in this paper, that voters, the kind of unknowingness or the scariness is turning voters away from things that they may actually need. You mentioned climate change. That's really scary. That's a really big, scary problem. Kind of a la COVID. And so, what do you think the prospects are for voters taking up those really big systemic or radical changes when they're confronted with this kind of other scary problem in front of them?
That's a great question. So first, let me just underline and second the thing you said at the very beginning, which is, and we say this in the paper as well. Actually, the margin we suggest, the change, so the effect size we demonstrate would not have been sufficient to shift the election. So it's a very big shift. It's the kind of shift that could have shifted a lot of elections. If we look at the French municipal or US House cases, there are certainly cases that are inframarginal to the effect size, but that's not true of the kind of Bernie Biden comparison. I guess um, I guess the first thing I'd say is, like, let's imagine that Bernie and Biden weren't candidates. And I should say, by the way, I actually you could read me to be a diehard Sanders supporter the way I've talked in this podcast. I should say, actually, I was on the policy team of a third candidate in the primary. Neither of the candidates we're talking about here, just for the record. That said, like, if these were indeed kind of political movements in the sense that they were political parties, these are certainly big enough shifts to change plausibly how many members of that party were in parliament, to change, kind of the coalition politics going forward, and thus kind of to influence policy. And on the kind of example here, and we are very much in speculative territory. What I just said about kind of radical change in answer to the last question, also speculative territory. But that's exactly what I have in mind. So that big, scary changes, the word in the middle is scary, and it often comes with big. And so if you think the changes we need are big, they're going to scare some people. So, what do we do to make those changes less scary? Well, call me a kind of like, for those in kind of American political circles, there's now this term called being shore-pilled, for following David Shore's work, right? So like, call me potentially shore-pilled, but I think it means we think about what marginal voters, what those in the middle, what will scare them and what messages are more palatable. On climate change specifically, I am extremely biased and on this front, but I have a good friend named Tricia Shrum who's an economist at University of Vermont, runs an organization called Dear Tomorrow, which asks people to kind of write letters to their grandchildren about what they did about kind of the problem of climate change today. This is not just grandparents, right? This is, or children, right? This is, people on the street, people in a shopping mall, teenagers, etc. And having been part of a few of these events, I have seen, I've listened to people kind of talking about like, oh, yeah, I've never really thought about the salience of what the kind of costs are, right? And I think we need to kind of find a way to change the time horizon. My friend Bina Venkataraman wrote a book called The Optimist Telescope, which argues the same thing. We need to change kind of how far people are looking to get to better solutions on these important questions. That said, I'm way over my skis here. I don't normally think about voting, much less political messaging. And what you have, and you should very much take this as the response of somebody who cares a lot about these issues, but not somebody who's a kind of academic expert on them. But I think we need big change. I think that means figuring out a way to make those big changes less scary for the people who are going to decide over them.
Thank you, Dan Honig. Flight to safety, COVID-induced changes in the intensity of status quo preference and voting behavior is forthcoming in the American Political Science Review. We'll put details of some of Dan's key research in the show notes for this episode. And we thank Dan for this fascinating conversation and really the contribution of this piece to understanding more about voters' preferences. Next week, we'll be discussing a book by our colleague, Dr. Julie Norman, which examines resistance activity by prisoners in Palestine. What are their experiences and what are the broader lessons for other conflict situations? Remember to make sure you don't miss out on that or future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics. All you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Jennifer Hudson. Our producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you very much for listening.